Hello, geometry students. I'm so excited to be teaching you your first online lesson. We are going to learn about the Pythagorean theorem today. And all you need is a piece of paper and a pencil. Be sure to pause the video if there's a spot where you need to re-listen to a particular segment to make sure that it's not moving too fast for you. And also be sure to put down any questions you have on your paper so when we have our Zoom session after this, you'll be able to have those questions answered. All right, so we're learning about Pythagorean theorem, and all I need you to do is write at the top Pythag. I'd also like you to think about how would you draw a right triangle. So we're going to draw a triangle. Think about if you know what else I would need to add to the picture of that triangle to show that it has a right angle. The thing that we need to add is a little box, and that is a way of saying that this angle is 90 degrees, so the whole triangle is a right triangle. Now, the triangle has three sides. We call the two sides that are not across from the right angle the legs, and the side that is across from the right angle we call the hypotenuse. If you can, go ahead and write down the Pythagorean theorem now. The Pythagorean theorem is a squared plus b squared equals c squared. Now some of you might wonder, what are the a, b, and c? The a, b, and c are just names for the sides of the triangle. So the a and b are the two legs, and it doesn't really matter which one is which. And the c is always the hypotenuse. So the c is always the number that represents the side across from the right angle. Let's do an example to kind of clarify this and demonstrate what we mean. So go ahead and just write down example 1, then draw another right triangle. And we're going to label this right triangle with legs of 3 and 4 and a hypotenuse of x. X meaning that we don't know what it is yet, and we're going to try to solve it. So I'd like you to see if you can write down what equation you would need to have to solve this problem. What equation would you put to solve this problem? All right, the equation is going to be 3 squared plus 4 squared equals x squared. Now to square something means to multiply the number times itself. So 3 squared is 9, 4 squared is 16, and of course x squared is just x squared. 9 plus 16 is 25. And we do need to take the square root of both sides, and we get that x is 5. So what we just did with Pythag is figure out the length of a missing side of a right triangle. So that is a very common right triangle and a really good one for you to know. All right, let's do another example. Example number 2. Again, draw a right triangle. It doesn't have to be perfect, doesn't even have to be to scale. Just needs to have 3 sides and a right angle. And then I'd like you to label the legs 5 and x and the hypotenuse 13. Okay, think if you can what equation you would need to set up to solve this problem. Now I have to give you a hint, there's a little bit of a trap here. This problem is harder than the first one. So think carefully, set up your equation if you can. The equation should be 5 squared plus x squared equals 13 squared. Notice in Pythagorean theorem, the c squared, the number or letter that's on its own, is the hypotenuse. So in this case, the 13 or the hypotenuse is something we already knew. It was the leg that we didn't know. So that is why the x is on the other side of the equal sign in this example. All right, so we have 25 plus x squared equals 169. We're going to subtract the 25 from both sides and get x squared equals 144. We're also going to take the square root and get x is 12. Now remember, you can pause this video at any time in order to make sure that you have things written down. Also feel free to zoom in as needed so you can see a little bit more detail. Now we're also going to talk about something called a Pythagorean triple. A Pythagorean triple essentially is taking one Pythagorean triangle and creating a new one by multiplying the lengths of the sides of the first triangle times another number. So let's do an example to make that a little bit more clear. For example 3, what I would like you to do is again label a right triangle. This time we're going to make the legs be x and 8 and the hypotenuse be 10. Now there are two ways that we can solve this problem, and I'm going to show you both. The first way is just to use the Pythagorean theorem. The second way is going to be to use the Pythagorean triple. So if we wanted to use the Pythagorean theorem to solve this, what would be the equation? If you can, go ahead and write that down on your notes now. The equation that we would use to solve this would be x squared plus 8 squared equals 10 squared. Or x squared plus 64 equals 100. We're going to subtract 64 from each side and get x squared equals 36. I'm also going to take the square root and get that x is 6. So our missing side in this case is 6. Now, I'd like you to see if you can think of another way I could have gotten that exact same answer. I'll give you a hint, and that is that you can use the information from one of the first two examples that we did. In the first example, the triangle had lengths 3, 4, and 5. And in the second example, the triangle had lengths 5, 12, and 13. Can you see any relationship between either of these triangles in the third one where the lengths are 6, 8, and 10? The relationship is that if we take our first Pythagorean triple, a 3, 4, 5, and multiply each number by 2, we would get the lengths of the second one. So what I could have done is just seen this triangle and gone, wait a minute. I can see that 8 and 10 are just 4 and 5 multiplied by 2. So the missing side needs to be 3 multiplied by 2, which is just 6. So that's kind of a little bit of a shortcut that you can use to solve many right triangle problems. They could be a multiple of a 3, 4, 5, a 5, 12, 13, or any other right triangle. Now, there is a word problem that's going to come up in one of your homework sheets, and it's very similar to a problem that often appears on SAT exams or standardized tests. So I want to do the problem with you and kind of break it down so it's not so difficult. I'm going to read the problem. Don't worry about writing this all down because I'm going to end up putting everything on the board for you. If you want to try to write it, you can. But 2 cars left home at the same time. I used to hate these when I was a student. One traveled north at 60 miles an hour. The other traveled west at 40 miles an hour. How far apart were they at the end of 2 hours? So the first thing that I think would be helpful for this problem is to do a mini review of what the directions are on a compass. So on a compass, north means up and south is down, and then west is going to the left and east is going to the right. So what will be helpful for this problem is to have a right triangle, and we can kind of think of going from this spot right here as being home, and the car that's traveling north can be going along this leg of the triangle, and the car that's traveling west can be going along this leg right here. So when it says that one car traveled north at 60 miles an hour and it was going for 2 hours, we can figure out how far it went using something called the distance formula. So this is another helpful thing to write down. The formula is D equals R times T, or distance equals rate times time. Now you should have learned this formula before, but it may have been so long ago that you still don't know it, or you've forgotten it. But just go ahead and write D equals RT. Rate is a fancy name for speed. The time here is 2 hours, and the first car was traveling 60 miles an hour. So to figure out how far it went, we just have to take 60 times 2 and get 120. The car went 60 miles for the first hour, 60 miles for the second hour, and then that ends up being a total of 120 miles. If we want to label our triangle here, we can put a 120 right there. Now we can use the same formula for the second car. It also was traveling for 2 hours, but it was only going 40 miles an hour. Now, some of you guys know that I ride a motorcycle, and I know from traveling all over the country that there are different speed limits in many different states. Depending on the situation, it might be as low as 20 miles an hour, or 25 miles an hour, or as high as 80. But this first car was going 60, the second one's going 40. 40 times 2 is 80. So if the second car went 40 miles an hour for 2 hours, it's going to go a total of 80 miles. We can use that because it was going west to label this leg of the triangle. Now the last question of the word problem was, how far apart were they at the end of 2 hours? So we're going to put an X here to show the distance between the two cars after they've gone 80 miles and 120 miles. Notice that this is a Pythagorean theorem problem, so let's set it up. 80 squared plus 120 squared equals x squared. And then we're going to square both of the numbers. 80 squared is 6,400. 120 squared is 1,400, or 14,400. When we add those two numbers together, we get 20,800 equals x squared. And we take the square root and get that x equals 144.2. Now notice that that's a decimal. And that's oftentimes what happens in real life problems, is you're going to get an answer that isn't a whole number. But that's okay. That's still the distance between the two cars after 2 hours. Now we're almost completely done with the notes. I just have 3 quick vocabulary words that I want to put up here. The first one is perimeter. That comes up on your worksheets. So perimeter just means the distance around. So for instance, if I were to find the perimeter of this triangle, I would be adding up 80, 120, and 144.2. So next to perimeter, just write down distance around. That should be good enough to kind of remind you the vocab word that you learned earlier in your math time. All right, the second kind of vocabulary word, I guess in this case we call it a formula, is area of a triangle. Can you think for a minute and tell me what the formula is for the area of a triangle? I know that you've all learned it before. Again, it's been a while since you've been in the math classroom, but if you know the formula for area of a triangle, go ahead and put it down. If not, we will just add it here right now. The area is 1/2 the base times the height. Some students like to write that base times height over 2. Either way is great. They both are the same thing. They're both equivalent. All right, the last vocabulary word is equilateral. This also comes up in your homework worksheets. Do you have an idea of what that means? There is a clue in the word because it has the word equal and it has the word lateral. Equal means same, essentially, and lateral is a fancy way of saying side. So basically an equilateral triangle is where all 3 sides are the same length. So let's write that down. All 3 sides are the same length. Okay, so you guys have the formula, you have an example of the word problem, and you have the vocabulary words. You're now ready to do your 2 Pythagorean theorem riddle sheets. Talk to you soon. Bye.